Hi, I'm Peter Rao, and welcome back to Counterbalance. Happy New Year, everyone. Mike Duran, my co-host, is on his way to Israel this week, so I'm sure we'll have an episode debriefing his trip to Israel and everything that he saw there. But we're kicking off 2024 with a bang because we have today my friend, a mentor, Ken Weinstein, and he is really one of the savviest foreign policy professionals out there. It's a real thrill to have you here, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for clearing the deck so I don't have to put up with my buddy Mike Duran for 45 minutes.
So Ken, by way of background, has a PhD from the much in the news Harvard University, where he earned his PhD in government, but he also studied at Sciences Po, did his master's there in France, so he's something of a Francophile. In fact, if you like to consume your election night coverage in French, odds are that you'll see Ken in studio talking about some sort of disappointment for the Europeans about American election results. He also is a Germanophone, and I've heard him on several occasions say to high-ranking Germans, if Germany had taken a different course in the 20th century, in the 30s and 40s in particular, he may have ended up running a German think tank in Berlin rather than the Hudson Institute, which he led from 2005 until 2020 here in Washington. Ken was also the inaugural holder of the Walter P. Stern Chair here at Hudson Institute, and more recently took the baton from H.R. McMaster as our new Japan chair. So, Ken, it's great to have you here. You, in 2009, co-edited a book on Herman Khan, who is our founder. And since prior to the reign of John Walters the Great, you were the last president and CEO of Hudson. Maybe I'd take you back to the founding of Hudson. And can you tell us a little bit about who Herman Khan was and why he envisioned and conceptualized and ended up launching Hudson to begin with?
Well, first, Peter, let me just say what a pleasure, what a thrill it is to be with you and to return the compliment to you. I mean, I have learned so much from you over the years and am always impressed by your analyses, which are never conventional, never state the obvious, and which really have helped broaden my understanding of the dynamics in U.S.-European affairs and also U.S. foreign policy more broadly. I say that absolutely sincerely, since I don't need to flatter you since you don't work for me anymore and I don't have to worry about you leaving this place. Yeah, you know, it is kind of funny being the Pope Benedict of Hudson Institute. No, just kidding, as the former president who gets to hang around. But this is a great institution. It's continuing to thrive under John Walters' dynamic leadership, reaching new heights. And the Institute really was founded by Herman Khan. Herman was really an unusual figure. And in a way, Herman was kind of typical in some ways of the great American intellectuals who arose in the post-World War II period. It may have been the height of American meritocracy. It was an age in which you talked about Harvard before, but it was really an age in which the Ivy League started to lose its dominance in shaping American foreign policy, American defense policy, in part because World War II was such a moment of democratization of our elites, and it was a moment in which, when you entered the armed forces, people were given an IQ test, and so at that point, it sort of really changed the dynamics because the fact that you had gone to Groton with all love to our beloved Walter Russell Meade of Groton fame, it had gone to Exeter, Andover, or the other boarding schools, St. Mark's, gone on to Yale or Harvard. It really marked a moment where you could achieve what you want to achieve because of your sheer intelligence. And I think it actually continued with the immense technological innovation that we saw arising in the thermonuclear age. And Herman was both a byproduct of that period, but also someone who really came to shape that period. Herman was born in Bayonne, New Jersey, spent part of his childhood in the Bronx before he moved out to Los Angeles after his father had passed away. His mother owned a grocery store. They lived on top of this grocery store in Fairfax in Los Angeles. They spoke Yiddish at home. But Herman, proved to be a real genius, both in his undergraduate studies, later in his time in the Army, where he served in the Signal Corps in Burma, And when he was in graduate school later on, and Herman had set out professionally. Originally, he wanted to become. He was originally going to. He had to support his family because his father was gone. His brother was not in good health, and he had to support his mother. And he was in the midst of. He had done theoretical math, had done physics in graduate school. But Herman was a true polymath in a way that people just aren't today. He had an encyclopedic memory. He was fascinated by ancient history. He was fascinated by questions of force and propulsion. He was fascinated by how nuclear weapons worked. And so Herman was about to leave graduate school and go on to a career as a real estate developer when his best friend from childhood, Sam Cohen, who was the uncle of the hydrogen bomb, said, "Hey, Herman, you got to join me and come to the Rand Corporation and meet with some of these people." And at that point, the late 1940s, Rand was was set up by the Air Force for the new era in which the United States was going to be the major power in global affairs, in which the nuclear era started to arise. And there were all sorts of questions about throw weights, about distances missiles could travel, about loading nuclear weapons onto missiles and trying to imagine different nuclear scenarios. Herman spent an afternoon at Rand and fell in love. And Herman was at Rand for a little more than 11 years. But Rand was not his kind of think tank in some ways. Rand was very hierarchical.
He was not a man to be caged.
Yeah, Herman was not a man to be caged. No, Herman was a man with huge appetites, professional, intellectually, physically, in every sort of way. And Herman found being at Rand very stimulating in the early years, but eventually he found it less than hospitable as an atmosphere. And Herman had done a series of lectures at Princeton University, I think it was in 1958, looking at the challenges of nuclear war. It was became a book called On Thermonuclear War. And the importance of the book was that Herman took scenarios that had been really in the halls of the Pentagon and nowhere else and put them out into public view about the dangers of what a nuclear war exchange might look like, what the world might look like in that kind of a period, what America might look like, what if our major cities were destroyed, what if the Soviets took out Chicago, we took out Kiev in those days, second biggest city in the Soviet Union. You know, where would people go? Would they have to hide in caves for a number of years until the nuclear fallout went away? And these scenarios brought huge panic into the public atmosphere, and the Air Force, which was Rand's big funder at the time, was not happy. Herman had to leave, and he decided he wanted to take his new approach to public policy, which was thinking about things in the broadest possible context. And it wasn't a kind of policy-focused thing where Herman would come up with a paper and say, these are the 4 things we must do, to prevent a nuclear war. Herman had this really broad approach, which involved understanding grand strategy, how leaders make decisions under pressure and when they have multiple options to consider from all sorts of directions, understanding that economics and technology and innovation are really the drivers of the defense industrial base and critical to a nation's, not only its net assessment of its understanding, and Herman was very close with Andy Marshall, the famed head of the Office of Net Assessment at the Pentagon, but Herman also understood the critical role of demography in these questions, and understood, and was one of he pioneered systems theories and future theories at Rand, which meant that he would look at the future and try to imagine the direction that a country could take, not just over the next 6 months to a year, but over the longer term. And so he wanted to come and found a new institute that would be much more freewheeling, and one that would fit his image, but that would also not just focus on questions of throw weights and nuclear issues, but also focus on economics, which became increasingly central to how he understood the way the world was going to work. And all these things actually have very clear implications today when we look at the strategic challenge of China in particular.
I encountered Herman Khan only intellectually, first in graduate school as a sparring partner of Schelling's, essentially, on nuclear deterrence theory. And he was set out at great length in what I consider the Bible of international relations theory, Contending Theories of International Relations, authored by the late, great Bob Pfaltzgraff, who just passed away, a longtime professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. But part of the founding story, and if you walk through Hudson's halls, you'll see in one of our glass windows the image of Kahn standing at our original headquarters next to Max Singer. What was Max's role as a co-founder of sorts, if I have that right, of Hudson?
Look, let me say, Herman was a genius. He was an outside-the-box thinker. He could not organize a two-car funeral. He couldn't organize a one-car funeral. Max, on the other hand, was very methodical, and they met actually. And first, let me pay tribute to Bob Pfaltzgraff from Fletcher, who was not only a leading scholar in international relations, but also a great friend to Hudson Institute. We did many joint events together, particularly on Latin America over the years, and came to know and really respect Bob as a thinker and as a teacher. Herman and Max met at an MIT summer study on nuclear weapons. I believe it was the summer of 1959. It was right when Herman started to think, or maybe 1960, Herman started to think about wanting to form a new think tank. But Herman had only some very vague ideas that he had cooked up with some friends. But it was Max who actually systematized these ideas. It was Max who really pushed Herman, and they became very close almost instantly. And they were from sort of two different sociological places on the sort of Jewish diaspora spectrum, if you will. Max was very much a German Jew. His mother had been involved in various committees for the United Nations in the 1940s. He grew up in Manhattan, I believe he went to Horace Mann private school, was not of the Yiddish-speaking world that Herman was. Max went to Columbia and went to Harvard Law School, and was very much sort of in that kind of Kennedy sort of zone of people trying to think through what the new world would look like around the New Deal. And both of them were Kennedy Democrats at that point, although they both gravitated more to the right over time. But it was Max had the kind of organizational understanding that could bring order to, as you said, the hard to cage Herman Khan. And it was Max who thought through the institutional structure for the new organization. It was Max who also thought through how to engage outside intellectuals to be members of Hudson Institute in those days. And the cast was extraordinary, from Raymond Aron to Henry Kissinger to Ralph Ellison. I mean, it was an extraordinary array of talent that were part of the original Hudson Institute.
Since you just mentioned Kissinger, a quick aside, I think I read in your tribute to Henry Kissinger a slight critique of systems theory in that piece. Can you just expand on that for a moment, since you mentioned Kahn as a pioneer of systems theory? Is it that essentially regional, cultural, and history studies have gotten lost in the fray along the way, or is that a misreading of what you meant?
It's partly that. Look, I think systems theory has come to dominate the study of international relations and to abstract from the real questions that policymakers think of. When you think about the international liberal system, or you think about balance of power in the kind of abstract, sterile categories that systems thinkers tend to think about international relations, it takes away from the importance of individuals. It takes away from the importance of statesmanship, leadership, strategy. It takes away from the understanding of geostrategic questions of demography, and the like. And so what it does is it removes one from history, and I'm always amazed when I look at you read anything that Kissinger wrote, and he had an immense knowledge of the Romans in particular, and obviously the rise of Western Europe in the 19th century. And his work is suffused with this deep knowledge that policymakers face choices that are often not of their own making, and that they have to come up with creative means to get to a better future. And and when you look at American foreign policy today, so much of it is sloganeering, so much of it is either abstract idealism, based on a world order that doesn't exist except in some minds of international law experts, or it's sloganeering in some sense, where people are not really trying to solve foreign policy problems, but they're trying to play to an American political audience, and so this is the real challenge that the great statesmen face. Kissinger understood this, that you can't quite communicate what it is you want to achieve to an audience in a sense that isn't quite ready to accept it, and in part because it's a challenge of complex foreign policy in a democratic world where the public lacks the essential foreign policy understanding in some sense, and it's up to the statesman to try to educate them. But while you're moving things along, it's a very fraught process. And I think back to one thing when I was reading one of the Harry Truman is someone who fascinates me endlessly in some ways, because he had this deeply populist understanding of American of what America was about, a very different, talking about the shifts we mentioned earlier with regard to foreign policy at the end of.
He was a huge admirer of Jackson.
Yes,
Truman was. And
Jackson
is
Andrew
the
Jackson.
populist par excellence. So
a huge admirer of Jackson, but he also was someone no college education, but he spent his high school beginning. He thanks his high school teachers. They got him fascinated in ancient history, and he spent so much time reading Plutarch's Lives. He spent so much time reading the ancient Greece, the ancient Romans, and he used to say, there's nothing new under the sun, that old Plutarch didn't know about. And you have a sense that someone like a Truman, who was not Kissinger had this amazing classical education in part from his father, who was dedicated to the German notion of Bildung, of formation, of you had to read the great classics, the ancient classics, you had to read the German classics, you had to have a deep understanding of history,
right.
You had to have an understanding of classical music, and all these things shaped your soul. Truman, he was hardscrabble, had none of that benefit, but had some incredible teachers in high school, because he didn't go on to college, who really shaped him, and he just had a much richer understanding of the relation between rhetoric and policy, between what strategy really entails, and what leadership. And I don't like using that word, but what that means. And our I think our policymakers today sort of think they're working off a kind of a blank slate in a way, in part because of because of this kind of the dominance of systems theory. There are very few classically educated people with a deep understanding of history, which often comes to bite us in foreign policy. And so it's this kind of sterile, ahistorical approach that tries to kind of make foreign policy into some sort of a scientific study that really it puts us at a huge disadvantage. It's not the way that our adversaries see the world, certainly.
Although if any era shows the importance of actual occupants of leadership positions, you think it would be our own, given the contrast between, say, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, or Joe Biden and Donald Trump are pretty steep. Before we go to the policy questions, let me just complete the origin story of Hudson, because you were the Walter P. Stern holder of that chair. And I've heard you say in private, probably publicly as well, I know John has said this, there would be no Hudson Institute without Walter Stern. Who was Wally Stern, and what was his role with Hudson?
Look, first let me say Wally was. It's hard to talk about Wally in the past tense. So we're coming up to the second anniversary of his death. Wally was just an extraordinary individual, and just as Max brought order to
chaos,
Herman's chaos, Wally brought a kind of bourgeois sensibility to Herman's chaos as well. And I don't mean bourgeois sensibility in a bad way. I mean, Herman was a guy who couldn't keep a schedule, was not, occasionally someone would host a dinner for him, and Herman was not always very good about getting himself not only there on time, but getting himself there, period. And Herman and Wally met in a sort of very typical Stern family way. Betsy Stern had taken in a woman from Nashville into their house whose husband had they'd go
Betsy,
through
of course, being Wally's wife.
Wally's widow, taken in this woman who had been an extraordinary woman in her own right, Gail Neal, first female president, eventually became the first female president of a major American think tank. Gail had moved up from Nashville. Betsy was from Nashville, where her own family was very involved in philanthropic activities in life. And Gail had moved in with the Sterns because her husband had left her. He had, I think it's fair to say, serious alcohol issues. And this was a young mother with kids. They moved in with the Sterns, which is so typical of just how unbelievably selfless they are. And then Betsy applied for a job being assistant to Herman Khan. Now, this was a job that that was a famous job. Midge Decter had this job. One of Saul Bellow's many wives had this job. It was a job people would normally kind of cycle through because Herman was just brutal to work for. Not that he wasn't a difficult boss, but he was just so unorganized that eventually people would your patience would run out with him. And those were the years where women didn't have the same professional opportunities as men. So you had these unbelievably talented series of women working for Herman. And then one day, Gail, who had just applied for a job announcement she saw in the newspaper, told Wally, you ought to come to Hudson and meet this guy, Herman Kahn. You'll find him interesting. So Wally goes to a lecture. Wally lives in Westchester. He's in Scarsdale. He drives up to Croton on Hudson, and he's just immediately taken by Herman. And he's partly taken by Herman. Wally was then a young investor on Wall Street and was fascinated by long-term trends in investing. And I think part of it was Herman's long-term focus on the world. In those years, Hudson was doing work on the next 100 years. Famous book that Herman produced in 1968 was The Year 2000. And these were books that looked really at the long-term projections of where the United States and the world were going. And Herman and Wally just clicked. And then eventually Herman got asked very quickly to join. Wally got asked to join the Hudson Institute board. And at the end of the first meeting, I think it was 1974, Herman asked Wally, Wally went up to Herman and said, Herman, this meeting is chaotic. I'm not going to try to do my Wally Stern invitation. It wouldn't be respectful, but, you got to sit down and, and bring some order to this thing. It's just not going to work. And then Wally's like, and then at the end of that, Herman just talked to Wally for 5 minutes and said, why don't you become chair of the board? And Wally essentially was chair of the board from 1974, I think it was, really up until 2006. And he was chairman through some very difficult times for Hudson, including just financial challenges that were unimaginable that the Institute faced in our early years at Croton on Hudson. I mean, I remember an apocryphal story that one time the Institute couldn't make payroll, but thankfully the guy who was the driver, you needed a driver because getting people to take the train up to Croton from New York City all the time and go to the train station, and we received King Baudouin of Belgium. We received major figures from around the world and leading academics and the like. And fortunately, one time they were about to miss payroll, but the driver actually won a decent amount of money in the New York State lottery and was able to lend his whatever he won to make payroll that month. And I remember there was a very highly recruited new president at Hudson Institute who came on board, and within a week of coming on board, somebody came to him and said, "Well, what are we going to do about payroll?" He's like, "Well, just go right ahead and process it." He goes, "Mr. Kahn didn't tell you it was never been Mr. Kahn. It was Herman didn't tell you." He's like, "Well, we actually can't make payroll," and then more money had to be borrowed, and so there were some really challenging years for the Institute. But Wally stuck with it, saw that Herman's genius was needed if it could be properly harnessed for the better of our country and the challenges we faced in the Cold War, in the challenges we faced following the Arab oil embargo, in which Herman presented a very bullish account of how we could get to American energy independence, a lot of which involved hydraulic fracturing, oils from Canada's tar sands. Also, and he was talking about this in the 1970s when no one else was. And so Wally stood by Hudson, was our biggest benefactor, but more importantly, was really our guiding light throughout. And when Herman Khan died It was
in the early 1980s.
In 1983, it was a deeply challenging moment for the Institute. There were some people who said the place ought to close its doors, it's done. And Wally said, no way, we're going to keep this place alive. And as in the early years, I just say Wally became thankfully a much wealthier man over time. And he lived through both great frustration with Hudson over, some moments. And I'm glad to say, and I'm very proud that, as you know, Wally is God, it was, almost 5 decades of loyalty to the Institute. And I think, he knew at the end of his life that we had come back to the greatness that he had seen in the early years in a different way, and was very pleased with the Institute. But Wally had like Herman, Wally had a near photographic memory, knew things, there were times where Wally would pick up things in our research that I had sort of overlooked, and it was always a little daunting going into his office. Saying, well, what do you think about this? I'm like, well, but he was just such a fundamentally decent human being with a huge heart, and someone I always went to for advice at really critical moments.
Well, in a way, this is a nice contrast to the systems theory, because these are great individuals who really powered the organization. And maybe we can take that tact also into the policy world, because as the Japan chair, Japan has undergone a great transformation. Offhand, I heard a remark a few years ago where someone said, it might have even been Walter, in a column, Japan is now our most important ally. And that really sort of took me aback for a moment, because that very well could be true. It just isn't something that had occurred to me for some time. And maybe the individual who made that happen is your dear friend, also the recently departed Shinzo Abe. Can you tell us a little bit about Shinzo Abe, who opened our headquarters here under your leadership? There's some great pictures online of you and him smiling jovially during that event, and how it came to be that he grew so close to you, to the Institute, and his role in making Japan, I should say, kickstarting the process, as I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, of putting Japan in the direction it needs to go for it to really play the role we need it to play in the 21st century.
Yeah, I'm going to return to Herman, to Wally Stern for 1 second, because there's a link to Wally, Japan, and the like. And,
okay.
And one of Wally's great qualities, probably one of his great qualities, in addition to his selflessness and his brilliance, was his humility. Wally was the most unself-important person in the world, and particularly, when you're dealing with donors and you're dealing with politicians, you're dealing with people with huge egos. And I got to say, Wally was very Japanese in this sense, that he never made a big deal about himself. And I think it's a deeply Japanese quality, actually. And so when we talk about Japan becoming America's most important ally, it's something I've believed for years and have written about. Look, my sense is that Japan has become our most important ally now, and it's been, I think, our most important ally, really, going back probably I'd say almost 10 years, if not. And why is that the case? It's because we are currently facing, Japan is the world's it's become the world's 4th largest economy, because the yen is so weak that somehow the Germans have now surpassed the Japanese in terms of GDP, but the Japanese will bounce back as the yen comes back. But it's become our most important ally because of the strategic challenge we face with China, and the fact that, which is a massive strategic challenge, which involves not just a military challenge, a geopolitical challenge, it's a geoeconomic challenge, it's a soft power challenge, it's an economic development challenge, and Japan has really come into its own because of Prime Minister Abe. And let me first step back and contrast Japan with the other contenders for the most important ally. Okay, I never say Japan is I think Japan has become our closest ally. We're not there yet. There's a big cultural gap between our countries, and it's not just that Japan is an Indo-Pacific country where English is not as well spoken as it ought to be. the cultural challenge goes deeper in other ways.
It has the insularity one would expect of an island nation, which is sort of paradoxical because it's an exporting superpower. But at a personal level, what I find challenging is we as Americans, and this is vast caricature, but it's nonetheless worth pointing out, can be very open and braggadocious almost, whereas the Japanese are so reserved. I never quite know if I'm landing with the Japanese when I'm making a point, because the same smile and nodding along takes place probably no matter what I'm saying. And that, I think, is tough for especially people who have little background as I do. I know very little about Japan in reading the country.
Yeah, look, I think the Japanese are different in that they don't instantly warm to someone. Americans, everybody becomes our best friend within 30 seconds. You make a couple of jokes, you say something emotional, and all of a sudden you've got a best friend for life.
Right.
That is not the Japanese. You have to build relations of trust. It takes time. It takes cultivation. And I think, to return to Shinzo Abe, let me first give credit to Herman Khan.
Well, I didn't mean to cut you off on the other contenders for the.
Oh yeah. You look around. Okay, Germany. Germany has always pursued at least since the end of the Cold War, its own independent foreign policy to some degree, in which it has often hid under the American security umbrella to pursue, first it was obviously relations with Russia, to some degree relations with Iran, otherwise relations with China, particularly on the commercial side in all three cases. Now it's sort of stepping back from all these things, but I think there's still a deep-rooted anti-Americanism in Germany, that comes to the fore. And France similarly has got a very independent strength. France obviously brings much greater military prowess than Germany has much more of a strategic mindset than the Germans tend to have. But there's also a tendency, and we see it with President Macron, of trying to kind of counterbalance American foreign policy whenever possible. And France has got, and has always had this, whether it be under de Gaulle or elsewhere, that sort of it is an extraordinary. You want to be in the trenches with Japan. I mean, with France. I apologize. You want to be in the trenches with France, but when France tries to sort of show these slight differences, is when France gets irritating. The UK is just not the extraordinary power that it once was, and we needed Boris Johnson's leadership on Ukraine to really bring pressure on the United States. It was critical. But the special relationship isn't what it once was, with all due respect to our British friends, even if we have immense ties, cultural ties, deep affinity, and obviously the common language and amazing intelligence collaboration. Israel certainly has captured the hearts of most, but certainly not all Americans, as we're seeing. Israel's immense technological prowess has been a massive force multiplier for the United States in the Middle East. But
you're also starting to move into categories of countries who can't project the same amount of power as
Absolutely.
Japan would be able to if it really mustered.
Yeah.
With all due respect to Israel as a technology superpower, it has nuclear weapons, which Japan does not, et cetera. But still, It's in a different league, I would say, as the Japanese.
Absolutely. And I think, and look, and it all goes back to Herman. I mean, it was a study Herman was doing for the Pentagon in 1962 on whether it's the perennial question, would Japan get nuclear weapons? And Herman determined that Japan wouldn't need to get nuclear weapons, that it could because of the size of its economy over time, it could quickly weaponize if it needed to. But the most interesting thing that came out of Herman's study was in 1962, he realized the Japanese economy was growing at 8% a year and would continue to grow at 8% a year, and that Japan would become the world's second largest economy at some point in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And Herman's prediction was spot on. It gave immense confidence to the Japanese, and Herman became close to every Japanese prime minister from Prime Minister Ikeda in 1962 or 63 on. And it was at a time when General de Gaulle was asked to meet with the Japanese prime minister at the Élysée and dismissed him as a transistor salesman. But Herman saw that Japan was, in a sense, the country of the future. And it was that foundation that really helped. We had not done a lot of work on Japan for some time, but returned to it around 2000, where I had done a speech from some Japanese business leaders about the potential for the Japanese economy. Japan has one of the highest savings rates in the world. A lot of this money is either kept, unfortunately, under mattresses or in negative interest governments, savings bonds. And essentially, if the Japanese could figure a way to restructure corporate governance, could configure a way out to restore confidence in its own stock market, and could get individuals to put money into rather than into passive investments that lose money into active ones, there was a potential for Japan to really sort of turn its economy around. And I was invited to give a talk in Japan in early 2003. It was my first trip to Japan, and I had the good fortune on that trip to meet a young Diet member, Shinzo Abe, and we just hit it off. And I would see him pretty regularly. When I became CEO of Hudson in 2005, I didn't want a reception in Washington, but my Japanese friends held one in Tokyo, and Abe keynoted it. And Abe became prime minister. It served one very short term in 2007.
Bowed out for health reasons, I believe.
Right? Yeah. He had a autoimmune disease, ulcerative colitis, and at that point, the kind of treatments for it were not as good, and he was really in immense physical pain and emotional pain.
Debilitating, at least what I gathered.
It was absolutely debilitating, and he had to step down at the end of the year. It was a deeply humiliating time. It was humiliating for him as prime minister to be. Shinzo Abe was the grandson of the great Prime Minister Kishi of the post-war period, a somewhat controversial figure in Japanese history because of his ties to the imperial era. The son of Shintaro Abe, who was a great Japanese foreign minister, and Abe had always been trained to become a prime minister, and he had an immense strategic understanding. And this was his real genius. Was he had an unbelievable strategic understanding, and we did a conference on U.S., Japan, India trilateral relations in Tokyo in the summer of 2006, July 2006, and Shinzo Abe keynoted it. And his remarks at that conference, which we did with a Japanese think tank, the Asian Forum Japan, which has been a close collaborator of ours, he talked about the need to deepen U.S., Japan, India trilateral relations, the key role of Japan, India bilateral relations as key to the future of the Indo-Pacific. And he already had the seeds for the notion of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which was the strategic idea that was the basis of his second term as prime minister. The concept that he rewrote the map of Asia. So Asia-Pacific is dominated by China, which is the largest country. But if you bring the democratic allies of Japan, Australia, United States, India is not an ally. You bring us all together.
He's the godfather of the Quad.
It gives meaning to the Quad. It gives meaning to a broader map of Asia, and the fact that you could engage the Indians in the strategic competition with the Chinese. To a certain degree, the Indians always have a multifaceted foreign policy, was critical. And Abe understood this. He got this understanding from his grandfather, certainly from his father. And he thought about issues really strategically in a way that few American leaders do.
So what was Japan when he took power, and what was Japan when he was assassinated? Which is to say, how did he, in addition to having these strategic thoughts, actually change Japanese society to perhaps gain more acceptance for some of these theories? Because Japan, at least this is just the common reading, is sort of deeply pacifist over the years. It's underinvested in its armed forces, which were not even called armed forces, required constitutional changes, et cetera, et cetera. Can you walk us through a little bit of Abe's role in all of that?
Sure. Look, I mean, before Shinzo Abe, Japan had followed a foreign policy really that was a timid multilateral foreign policy that kind of hid behind multilateral institutions, the UN and the like. It was very process-focused. And it also, Japan placed great value on its bilateral relationship with the United States, but placed less value on its own bilateral relations with other countries. And Abe understood he wanted Japan to be what he called a normal nation, meaning that Japan should take responsibility for the legacy of World War II, for the destruction it caused, but also come to the understanding that Japan had to be a normal nation, that it had to deal with other countries as an equal, and that it had a right to play its own role on the global stage. And so Abe began when his second term as prime minister, and I would see him regularly, as Scooter Libby and I in particular would go over and see Abe very regularly in the years between his first prime ministership and his second. And it was a time when people had written him off. He became a bit of a joke in Japan. And Abe was unbelievably loyal to the people who were loyal to him. And personally, I didn't view it as loyalty to him. I viewed it, I was dealing with a world leader who had an unbelievably nuanced understanding of foreign policy. And so Abe's hope was to really transform Japan's role on the world stage and to kind of escape both from the shadows of this multilateral foreign policy, but also to some degree to escape from the shadows of being a partner that would listen to what the U.S. said, and I think the moment the U.S. that Abe really emerged from the shadows as prime minister, there were a few moments. First, he's traveled to well over 70 countries around the world to develop bilateral relations. He set up a free trade agreement with the European Union, numerous free trade agreements. He was obviously the master of which we'll return to in a second, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the U.S. backed out of and refashioned it to an 11-country agreement that's become increasingly important, in which the U.K. is now joining. But I think Abe's great strength was when he fashioned the free and open Indo-Pacific, in part as an alternative to China's Belt and Road. He went down to Mar-a-Lago. He took this incredible trip, which nobody would have done, which was just the Japanese, as I said, very modest, very humble, don't put themselves out front. But Abe had been told by his foreign ministry, do not engage with Donald Trump during the 2016 election. He's going to lose. He's going to get killed. Those of us who were friends of Abe, myself included, go engage. It's important. Trump really could win this. The odds were looking good. And Abe decided to go meet President-elect Trump at Trump Tower in November of 2016, right after the election. And he was the only world leader who got him. He was heading to South America for the APEC summit, the only world leader who got a meeting with Trump. The meeting went extraordinarily well.
He cracked the code in a way that other world leaders did not, or I should say some world leaders struggled. I mean, you contrasted Germany to Japan a moment ago. Angela Merkel never got off on the right foot with Donald Trump. Shinzo Abe did.
Well, look, first of all, I think Merkel, honestly, in my book, was someone who, I think she was like Barack Obama was. She never was open about what her real policy aims were, and she just couldn't develop a relationship of trust with President Trump. Trump would push her and say, look, your ships don't sail, your planes don't fly, your submarines don't submerge, but you're screwing us on automobiles. She would refuse to increase defense spending. She always denied that she was playing this trade game with the United States, and Trump just didn't like her. Whereas Abe was very straightforward. Abe began from a notion of what is it that the United States wants? What is it that we can do together? And I think he really was able to show President Trump and the leadership team very early on that the free and open Indo-Pacific that concept was the best way to meet the challenge of Belt and Road, and that Japan and the United States had a lot to do on the security side, on the defense side, that he was willing to spend money to do that he was willing rhetorically to do this, and that he was willing also to take risks with regard to North Korea as well to try to solve the nuclear question. And that summit at Mar-a-Lago that took place in February of 2016, everybody focuses on the fact that they golfed together, that they had a wonderful time, but it was a critical moment in the history of U.S.-Japan relations, because the United States signed on to the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which Shinzo Abe developed. I can't think of another time that a U.S. leader has signed on to such a fundamental shift in policy that then became not only military, a strategic doctrine for us. It became a grounding for our foreign policy in Asia. It led to the renaming of our Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command. It reshaped the way we thought about the Asia Pacific. And also at that summit, there was you'll remember there was a North Korean missile launch that occurred when they were together, and President Trump got up to the microphone at Mar-a-Lago after dinner with Prime Minister Abe and got up and said, the United States stands by its great ally Japan. I will now yield to Prime Minister Abe to say what our joint response will be, which nothing like that had ever happened in the United States. And for all the talk about Trump being a unilateralist and not listening to allies, it's just bunk as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there was a moment of I've never seen a U.S. President treat a prime minister like that. And they spoke dozens of times. They met regularly. They were incredibly close. President Trump, in there's a book that he produced recently of letters to the president. Shinzo Abe has more play in that book than any other world leader. 5 pages. They were personally close. Their wives were close, and it was a moment where Abe knew not only he had to be close to President Trump, but he also became very close to European leaders and other leaders as well, because the space kind of opened because of Trump's challenging relations with the Europeans. And so he was able to play both in the U.S. and in Europe, and also to some degree in Asia as well. And there, I think, with regard to the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, the notion that it was up to the democratic nations to work together to promote freedom of navigation, sovereignty, trade, different roads to economic development, and over time, the Japanese notion of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which began kind of the development concept. The Japanese have long been focused on Southeast Asia as a major target for economic development. The Japanese moved more towards a security posture on the free and open Indo-Pacific, and the United States, we took it to be a security concept, but we then moved and redeveloped our development agencies, creating the Development Finance Corporation to meet the massive challenge of these big investments that China was putting into the region. And so it was an amazing moment of strategic convergence, as our colleague Jim Pristup describes it. And it was a real rise.
Do you think the Biden team and the current Japanese leadership are continuing on that trajectory?
Absolutely. No, it's been a moment of real continuity there. I think that it's an area where the Japanese are increasing defense spending 60% over the next now in the next 4 years. They have stepped up their cyber capacities. They're setting up in a information security system so that they can greatly increase their joint intelligence operations and other operations with us. At the same time, the Biden team is also focusing a great deal on the Indo-Pacific under Japan's lead. And here's a place where I think Japanese leadership matters. There are things that Japan can do, both independent of the United States or when it takes the lead on things, that come off better. When we take actions in Asia, it is oftentimes viewed that we are acting because we're so focused on Taiwan. Japan understands the importance of a Taiwan scenario. Japan understands, as Prime Minister Abe said, that a Taiwan scenario is the Japan scenario, but the Japanese are not viewed by the rest of the people in Southeast Asia as kind of in the so-called Thucydides trap, where we're constantly worried about our status with regard to China, and which is an unfair description, incidentally, but that mindset has captured thinking of elites in Southeast Asia. So, that goes on. I think certainly a second Trump term would see a much stronger focus on security and defense in Asia than we've seen from the Biden team.
Well, I neglected to mention Ken was nominated by President Trump to be our ambassador to Japan, so ambassador designate to Japan in 2020. A man of many titles, and many credentials. The most important of which you added recently, that's of grandfather. So we'll close with a personal question. I have 3 little kids, as you know. Question to you: many people are saying, as Donald Trump would put it, that to be a grandfather is even better than being a dad. True or false?
Oh, true. Look, it is.
Your kids are going to hate that one, Ken.
I will quote the actress Kristen Scott Thomas, who said that children are the price we pay for having grandchildren. And so it was in the context. I think she said that loss is the price we pay for love, and children are the price we pay for grandchildren. So hang on, Peter, and God willing, you'll be there before too long.
Well, Mazel Tov. Thanks so much for joining us, Ken. It's been great having you. We'll have to have you back to dig into some of these topics in even more detail. But Happy New Year to all of you watching or listening or doing both at home. And thanks for joining us on Counterbalance.
Thank you, Peter.